Civic nationalists are losing the immigration debate in Britain, and whether or not Britain is a nation of values or ethnic groups, the indigenous peoples of the English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish, has hitherto been the preoccupation of podcasters or people debating the issue on X, but now it's being reflected in the polling, as The Guardian reports here. A new survey from YouGov finds that in 2023, only 19% of people said that you had to be born in Britain to be considered truly British. That is now up to 36% in 2025. So the momentum is clearly in the direction of nativism. But the more interesting stat to focus on is among supporters of Reform UK, the most popular party in the country that is set at present to win the next election and form the government. Among those supporters, 71% say that having British ancestry is a prerequisite for someone to be truly British, and 59% say they believe the nation is an ethnic, not a civic, community. Translation: you can only be British if your parents or your grandparents are native to this land. And Britain is not a nation of values, basically a Scout's pledge of liberal platitudes that anyone from anywhere could hypothetically believe in. Instead, no matter what we believe, it is a nation of families, of people, a distinct ethnic group to whom the nation belongs and is named after. England is the land of the Angles, according to the Venerable Bede. This is the sentiment that underwrote the protests in the summer, not just the protests by concerned parents outside asylum hotels that were housing foreign sex offenders that preyed on their children, but also Operation Raise the Colours, the attempt to put up national flags in public spaces. Because what does a flag represent? Ownership of territory. And so if your flag becomes a protest symbol in your own country, it shows that the people to whom the country should belong no longer feel like they own the country. Instead, they feel dispossessed of it by a treacherous government, the various immigrant groups that have been brought in to be clients of that government, and vindictive colonisers given national platforms like Bob Villan at Glastonbury, who gloated, "Heard you want your country back, nuh-uh, shut the F up," characterising the nativist British right as backward gammons who deserve to be robbed of their own homeland. And the reason this is interesting is because Reform UK are a civic nationalist party. So the leadership of Reform UK are Nigel Farage, who said to Stephen Edgington in 2024 that demographic change is not something he is concerned about. He's only concerned about cultural change. So he is decoupling the culture from the people, not just who formulate that culture, but to whom it is most intuitive, to whom it is second nature, to whom it belongs. It is Richard Tice, who again told Stephen Edgington he isn't bothered about the white British becoming a minority in their own country by 2063, because he'll be long gone by the time that happens. And Zia Youssef, who is proposed as the heir apparent to Nigel Farage and Reform UK, who is a Sri Lankan Muslim who says that Britain is a nation of values that can be boiled down to paying taxes and obeying the law and practicing religious tolerance. So nothing particular. It's just the liberal container into which other cultures can be poured. And this is a disconnect from their own voters. But whether or not reform moves to reflect the position of those voters remains to be seen. And so there is a gap opening up in the Overton window for authentic political representation for the indigenous peoples of the British Isles who can form a political community based on shared identity to the right of reform. And who fills that? That's a question that remains to be answered. But the reason that civic nationalism is losing ground is because they have no answer for the edge cases which make themselves manifest on our timelines time and time again, in the form of Aqsa Rudakabana, the Southport murderer, or the Pakistani grooming gang perpetrators, who, despite their heinous crimes, which are tinged with racial resentment — remember, Rudakabana said he wanted white genocide, the Pakistani grooming gang perpetrators targeted girls because they were vulnerable, white, and non-Muslim — they have no response to this because, in large part, they aren't willing to recognise these people as not British, because despite being of a different ethnicity, they were born in Britain. Aqsa Rudakabana, born in Cardiff, so he's a Welsh choir boy. The Pakistani grooming gang perpetrators can't be deported because they've either renounced their dual citizenship or were born to purely Pakistani parents in Britain and so only have British citizenship, and so civic nationalists are unwilling to treat that citizenship as anything less than sacred, even though they violated said British values. so that contradiction can't be sustained, but also because they themselves tacitly admit that those who do violate British values cannot be considered British in some cases. And the most prominent example of this has been Alaa Abd El-Fattah, the absurd example of a revolutionary Egyptian activist who has had the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrat Party, the Conservative Party, and the previous and current governments working tirelessly to free him from prison in Egypt and bring him over to Britain, because in 2021 he was granted British citizenship, which he applied for because his mother is a British citizen, because his mother was born in Britain in the 1950s to an Egyptian woman who was studying for her PhD. So he is a second-generation anchor baby who spent a decade publicly on Twitter, in Arabic and in English, calling for the genocide of white people, the development of a nuclear weapons program by either Iran or the Taliban to kill white people, saying that the mistake South Africa made was not committing mass retributive violence against whites. He has all sorts of opinions about the British and Jews. This was all publicly available. And now the government is saying, well, he has British citizenship, so he's our problem. Whereas the likes of Reform UK and Kemi Badenoch over at the Conservatives are saying, no, take away his citizenship and deport him back to Egypt. And so the question is begged, why only this man? Why not all of the Pakistani grooming gang perpetrators and the family members who covered up for it? Why not Axel Rudakabana? Why not people who break your version of British values? And if you're unwilling to enforce British values, then what use is the propositional nation? And these contradictions cannot be sustained. And so, in lieu of a concrete definition of what a British person is, people default to the historical standard, ethnicity, because that is how nations have been formed. Nation has the same etymology as ethnicity. This is why in the Bible, Jewish people were a nation when they were living in Egypt without their own land. It's why they remained a nation, a people, while living in exile across Europe before they returned to Israel in 1948. It's why, when people leave their homelands and go elsewhere, they form ethnic diasporas. They are the Indian community living in Britain. What we mean is ethnic group or enclave. And so it seems unfair that it is only our country that should foot the bill, both economically and in terms of redefining our identity to encompass other people. It seems very unfair that only we should redefine our identity. Only we should be not allowed to be an ethnic group and have a nation owned by the ethnic group, whereas every other people gets to do that. And it is our great expense because we are now accommodating people like Alaa Abd El-Fattah, who aren't shy about the fact that they hate us and want to kill us, and the fact that all sorts of atrocities have been committed because we have handed out passports like participation trophies. And now lots of civic nationalists are saying, well, you have to keep those people in your country, even though they are not like you. You can tell by the mugshots, you can tell by the crimes they commit that are racially tinged and not in keeping with the traditional ways that English men and women behave. You have to keep them in your country because they were born here or because they have a British passport, and it would be extreme or unpalatable or authoritarian to take away their citizenship and send them elsewhere. And so you have the enforcement cost as a civic nationalist of saying people have to put up with completely optional crimes and deny their own identity and deprive themselves of political representation. Otherwise, they'll morph ineluctably into Adolf Hitler for some reason. So the enforcement cost for civic nationalism and the amount of contradictions that it tries to sustain is just too high. And so something will replace it. And it will either be a sensible recognition that ethnicity is real, that it matters much more to people who are not individualistically minded, like Christian Europe and England and America and the like, and therefore that the indigenous peoples of a country deserve to possess their own country, they deserve demographic security, and that this demographic foundation is actually the only way that they can accommodate a handful of non-native people who they want in their country, and that just being of a different ethnicity doesn't make you a good or bad person. Or things can get quite harsh, and people's appetite or how harsh they can get will grow according to just how much worse the circumstances get. You can already see the direction of travel towards acknowledging ethnicity. There will reach a tipping point where people will say, if it is either going extinct or being called racist, if it is either going extinct or ejecting every single person that is not ethnically of this place from our country, then they will be willing to be called racist and they will be willing to take drastic measures that, although they are unpalatable now, although they might be unjust according to my Christian standards, might be within the Overton window if things get significantly worse. If we reach the demographic tipping point where we become a likely persecuted minority in our own country. And so it is with this backdrop that the following debate between Andrew Gold and Steve Laws took place on the Heretics podcast 2 days ago. Andrew Gold represents civic nationalism, Steve Laws represents ethnonationalism. I subscribe to neither label because I think both are ideologies and I think they are both inconsiderate of the relationships that are obscured by the abstract categories of either ethnicity or values. And I'm less interested in disparaging the relative positions of both men, which I disagree with, than I am seeing how each man and this debate is a microcosm of the struggle for civic versus ethno-nationalism becoming the defining philosophy of the British right. Full disclosure, I've known Andrew for a couple of years, and despite our spirited disagreements on camera and off, we've always been friendly, and I don't know Steve, I would wager my politics are considered far too soft for him, but I want to be as charitable as possible here in defining both men's arguments, and using them to describe the direction of travel for politics for the next year. And so if I misconstrue anything about either of their arguments, please understand, I'm doing it in good faith, correct me in the comments. Steve advocates for total remigration, and that means anyone who does not have both parents being indigenous to the British Isles should return to their ancestral lands. And that includes mixed-race children. They should be deported to the country that their non-indigenous parent comes from. That will rub people up the wrong way, whether they're Christians or because of the individualistic sense of fairness deeply ingrained into British culture. Because treating someone like Ben Habib, who has an English mother and a Pakistani father, as no different than the perpetrators of the Pakistani grooming gangs seems unjust. However, that is dependent on the current moral order staying in place. And if conditions get significantly worse, if the crimes that are enabled by civic nationalism grow to such a scale that they are intolerable, you will see people's appetite for collective punishment outweigh, in desperation, their desire to be considerate to minorities. And Andrew's position, I think, makes the growth of Steve's position inevitable. Carl Benjamin did a video on this debate that generated quite a lot of online discussion, and he was saying that even though he disagrees with the harshness of Steve's position, as do I don't think it is necessary or just to expel people from the country purely based on ancestry rather than behaviour. He understands what Steve wants, or rather the people who agree with Steve want, and that is demographic security in their own country, a feeling of possession, the same spirit that motivated the Raising the Flags protest during the summer. And if civic nationalists cannot provide that security, if they cannot prevent the totally optional crimes committed by the descendants of immigrants from happening in our country, if they're not willing to deport people who violate their definition of British values and therefore are exposed as hypocrites, then people will become more tolerant of extreme and inconsiderate measures, even if they mistreat minorities who have done nothing wrong. And Carl, in his video, characterize Steve as doing a political ploy that is akin to Donald Trump's art of the deal, making the big ask. So, making the most outlandish position, the furthest edge of the Overton window, part of the mainstream conversation, to then get concessions from the other side in reaction to the most outlandish ask. Imagine you're trying to sell an item for £1 million, and you know that the other party wants to pay £500,000 for it. If you set the asking price at £10 million, they might go, whoa, that's way too much. And you can go, okay, we'll haggle and negotiate down a bit. Let's go to 5 million, let's go to 2 million. And so it makes that 1 million seem like a reasonable compromise. And so the same would be for the total remigration option. Saying, I want everyone who is not of native ancestry gone, seems like the big ask. And so, then to say, well, I want every foreign criminal, I want every person on benefits, I want all of the Boris wave, I want people who are recreating the conditions of their failed homelands in Luton or Leicester or Manchester or London, denaturalized and deported, seems like a much more reasonable ask from the original position of, well, everyone's as British as you and me, despite the religion, despite their ethnic origin, so long as they have the appropriate documents that says that they are. What I think that Carl is missing in his analysis, which I posted in a long post on X, is that the unwillingness of the civic nationalist position to concede ground to reality and to deal with the problem of foreign criminals or people changing the demographics and culture of our country and dispossessing the native population of their own country, makes the hardest possible edge of ethnonationalism that I think Steve will admit he represents more plausible. So even though it seems impossible now, even though it seems like a big ask now, the constituency for such a position will grow as the public become more desperate. And so this was made more possible by the fact that during the debate, towards the end, Andrew said that I think white people are going to go extinct anyway. And so if you set up the dichotomy of your opponent representing the expulsion of literally everyone who isn't of native ancestry from the country, versus you who says, well, we can't really do anything about demographic decline, it's an inevitability. Your ethnicity and your way of life is probably going to go extinct. We just have to make the best of being obsolete. Then people are going to say, well, the current trajectory is intolerable. These crimes don't need to happen. And so if it is an either or, I will side with the guy who is doing things that I think might be unjust, but a bit of injustice is preferable to total extinction. And so if you're only offering becoming a persecuted minority in your own country, or worse, mistreatment by vindictive colonizers like El-Fattah until you go extinct either through not having enough children or through violent means, then you aren't actually offering a viable alternative to the person that you think has an unjust position like total remigration. And so I wrote, if you don't want people to advocate for the expulsion of every non-native person from the country, then the absolute worst thing to say is, I think white people are going to go extinct anyway. If you set up a dichotomy where people either have to accept demographic extinction or deport every last immigrant and their offspring, then out of desperation people will say, send them all packing. People don't want managed decline, to live in the Michaela school, or their identity to be redefined as inclusive. Also an important point to say, Andrew Gold said his preferred model of running the state was to copy the way that the Michaela School tried to teach the children of immigrants to be patriotic by singing the national anthem and reciting Rudyard Kipling and learning Shakespeare. This is already a debate I had with Andrew on my episode with him. Getting girls in hijabs to sing poetry does not make them indistinguishably British from the native population. It does not stop the transformation of our culture into something unrecognizable. It does not slow down mass demographic change, which then is the driver of cultural change. All it does is provide a good education to the sons and daughters of immigrants, who will then probably take positions of leadership over the British population as they decline into a minority, and if they're allowed to retain their faith, for example, turn Britain into a Muslim country. which then Jews like Andrew will not be able to live in, just as white Brits are also persecuted. So it's ultimately a suicidal strategy that's not going to work, it's not desirable, but if that's what you're offering, and the only other alternative that you're setting up in this dichotomy is total remigration, then people are going to take the expulsion of literally everyone who isn't of native ancestry, even if it's cruel and unjust, to good people, like Ben Habib or Andrew Gold, over going extinct or living in the Michaela school. And so, if civic nationalists want to set up this dichotomy, this is why you're losing the argument. I finished with, if you cannot offer security for their people, their culture, their country, and their children, which are all reasonable requests, they will side with the person who will, no matter how harsh or unreasonable they are prepared to be. And the worse things get, the more people will be prepared to do that. I elaborated, saying, the sense of fairness ingrained in the British psyche won't see it as just or necessary to remove every non-native and mixed-race person from the country. It also isn't the Christian position. A remigration policy that withdraws benefits and bans incompatible cultures and behaviour will cause the vast majority to either be deported as criminals or to leave of their own volition to lands which cater to their customs and religion. And that will restore Britain to stable demographic foundations and stop replacement. But if you don't take the off-ramp, if that situation isn't reversed, the public will then inevitably choose the blanket remove everyone option rather than become a persecuted minority and die out. It is not fair or reasonable to tell people to go extinct. I think there are three types of civic nationalism, and they're all based on motivated reasoning. The first is ideologically liberal, that says we're all blank slates, that anyone from anywhere can become just as British as you and me, and that identity is purely plastic, and all differences are cosmetic, or can be ameliorated by education or redistributing funds through welfare and social housing. The second kind is Mott and Bailey civic nationalism, advanced by minority politicians, usually from the likes of India or Pakistan, that say they are as British as you and me, but also we need more representation of their particular ethnic group. We need more migration of their particular ethnic group. And so they are blood and soil nationalists for another country, like India or Israel or Pakistan, but are liberal pluralists in your country because it benefits them. And there's the third kind of civic nationalism, which I think is motivated by minorities who don't like woke, who don't like mass migration, who don't like Islam if they're Jewish, but who fear for their place in the country because they also consider themselves as a ethnic and religious minority, and so regard the host majority with suspicion and say, essentially, your identity must include me. Otherwise, I will actually stop siding with you because I'm worried you're going to kick me out. I'm worried that you're only ever one election away from expulsions or extermination camps. And if I may, I think Andrew's fallen into that third category because Steve, I'm not trying to be insulting here, doesn't deliver his position with a lot of charm. He doesn't throw that many jokes in. He is quite blunt about things. And so when he said to Andrew, I would deport you to Israel, despite Andrew not speaking Hebrew and his family being here for hundreds of years, and him being culturally English, I think Andrew has felt quite defensive from there, and so has defaulted to the position of, well, we need a civic identity to encompass people, otherwise if you start deporting Muslims, or if you start deporting African criminals, I could be next. And I think that's a fallacy, but if you pursue that fallacy, if you say, we can't withdraw citizenships from people, we can't deport people, we're kind of stuck with the problem, then you make it almost certain that people are going to side against you and with the more extreme position that you're worried about. And this is something that Andrew actually wrote about on Substack. So Andrew wrote a follow-up post because he got a lot of criticism for saying things like, I think white people are going to go extinct anyway, which he has now said, I was referring to sort of 10,000 years in the future, but nobody thinks on that timescale. It's not a very convincing argument. Human civilization has been around for less time than that, so we're actually more focused on the present and the survival of the next generation rather than whether or not human civilization is even going to exist in 10,000 years, let alone Ashkenazi Jews or white English people. And Andrew wrote in this what he really thinks about remigration and deportations, and he responded to Carl's video. And he said, even Carl Benjamin's suggestion that we send back those who came in the grotesque Boris wave from the past 5 years rings authoritarian and unjust to me. Ultimately, while I agree this is absolutely effed the country, these individuals mostly enter the country legally, often at great financial and personal cost. To then revoke their pass and uproot their lives because we decided that our prime ministers made a big mistake wouldn't be right. So, not only are you saying that these people who did not enter at great personal cost, by the way, 95% of them take more in taxes out than they will ever contribute, so we're actually paying them to be here. But not only are you saying that it would be unjust to remove people from the country, most of whom are not British citizens, most of whom are claiming benefits, or are not contributing more in taxes than they take out, who are from completely culturally distant countries, and who were not wanted. This is an express violation of the mandate given to Boris Johnson to reduce migration after Brexit, and instead he increased it to record levels from the third world. Not only are you saying that we can't do that, but you're saying that we are stuck with the problem forever because you would find it unpalatable. And again, people notice that this is a result of policy choices. The ability to reverse this situation is just a policy choice. It is on the table, and you're not providing a convincing argument as to why they can't. And so if you insist, if you dig your heels in, if you make this your position, if you say, no, the Boris wave has to stay here forever, which even Reform UK, who are soft civic nationalists, are promising to deport. If you're saying that, if you're promising to entrench the problem, and you're not providing a convincing enough solution as an alternative to the total remigration position, then more people are going to side with the total remigration position if you present this as an either-or, if you present it as a dichotomy. Again, I don't think it is a dichotomy. I think it's a false dichotomy. I think we can still do deportations and remigration policy based on behaviour rather than race or ethnicity. But if you say that we can't do my position, and you say the only two positions that exist are your position of civic nationalism that won't deport anyone, and Steve Laws's position that will deport everyone, as things get worse, as extinction looms, you're going to find more people side with the likes of Steve Laws, even if you or I think elements of that are unjust. The last point I wanted to raise is about Britain's Jewish community. It's clearly an anxiety that's playing on Andrew's mind because he is Jewish, and his reason for not supporting remigration policies, denaturalization and deportation, is because he fears the same could happen to him and other British Jews, because Steve said he would want that. And I feel that there's a need to address this because it's clearly part of the motivated reasoning that causes some Jews to not take the side of the British people when they're trying to regain possession of their own country. One example of this would be Stephen Pollard in The Telegraph. Now, I don't know Stephen, again, I don't wish to be uncharitable, but he's just written a piece saying why Alaa Abd El-Fattah should not be stripped of his British citizenship, and amidst all the reasoning, we get to kind of the real reason here. It's his fear that Labour has already shown its fear of sectarian Muslim parliamentary candidates and its propensity to pander to their views. Will it deem open support for the IDF unacceptable, and therefore grounds to denaturalise and deport Jews to Israel? What this does is it, and Danny Finkelstein's been doing this too recently, is it positions Jews as a minority indistinguishable from other immigrant groups, other religions, despite their history in the country. And it says, we should band together as a group of minorities to be suspicious of the majority and deprive the majority of possession of their own country and the ability to evict unwelcome guests because we could be next, even if those minorities include Muslims who are literally killing us in Manchester or in Bondi Beach. Michael Musbacher did something similar in The Telegraph as well, where he said, banning ritual slaughter would shame Britain. Those advocating it on the right are toying with the darkest forces in history, basically your Nazis. They think they are standing up to our country's Islamization, but those who will pay the price are observant Jews. And first of all, not true, because Israel is basically leading the way on like 3D printing, and whereas it is permissible for many Jews to eat 3D printed meat that has not been kosher slaughtered, because it's still kosher, most Muslims would not eat non-halal slaughtered meat. So I don't think that would be the case. But regardless, you're seeing the framing here as, well, Jewish people would object to you objecting to a Muslim cultural practice. Therefore, Muslims and Jews need to band together to prevent the British from asserting their personal cultural standards as the dominant majority. And instead, I think this is an unwise strategy, and it's going to encourage anti-Semitism, frankly. And I say this not wanting to see my Jewish friends kicked out of the country, Andrew Gold included. I think the better framing would be, and this is just a piece of advice, something that actually the Board of Deputies have done in the last week in response to the El-Fattah situation, which is to say El-Fattah's extremist and violent rhetoric is aimed at Zionists, Jewish people, and white people in general, and it's threatening to British Jews and the wider public, basically saying that we share a common foe, that many Jews have been in the country for hundreds of years, ever since Oliver Cromwell brought lots of them back about 400 years ago. I wouldn't go arguing that, as Andrew did in his debate with Steve Laws, that Jewish people financed the Norman Conquest, therefore they've got a long history, because the Norman Conquest was quite disruptive, and there are probably parallels to the current wave of migration and 1066 that you don't want to draw. Just a bit of advice. Instead, you want to say, look, we have been in this country for a long time, we are an ethnic group in this country, and even though we may not be native, we realise that our presence in this country is contingent on having good relations with the host majority. We are distinct peoples, and we can have friendships between those peoples. You're an ethnic group, we're an ethnic group, we have a nation that suits our ethnic group in Israel. We want, for the English, the same thing that we have in Israel, so that we can also live in England if you'll have us. And that will foster mutual recognition between peoples. That will foster reciprocity between peoples. That won't foster animosity. And it won't set up that false dichotomy of, well, either every single Boris Wave migrant and foreign criminal and person given a British passport like it means nothing by Civic Nationalists must stay, or you're a Nazi, versus everyone has to go total remigration now, it's the only solution, including people that have done nothing wrong and minority groups that might be able to live in peace here once Britain regains its overwhelming demographic dominance. I mean, Carl said 90%, I think 95% indigenous makes sense. It makes for a stable country. I would say, just to liberals, civic nationalists, Jews that are concerned about this sort of stuff, try and engage with the merits of the arguments made by people that recognise that ethnicity is a reality, and that, especially in the last few years, British citizenship is not a sacred and unquestionable right, that we don't need to have people in our country who hate us, Jews and whites alike, that we don't need to import or accommodate foreign criminals, that actually our major towns and cities should not be taken over by foreign enclaves and turned into little Islamabads or Lahores, and that actually it is completely acceptable to revisit the civic nationalist propositional nation settlement that has just been an aberration imposed upon us, disconnected from all of British history, where our nation was founded as a result of families and congregations and communities to become a nation, a distinct people. Otherwise, you're going to make people so desperate that they will become tolerant of injustice to individual people who have done nothing wrong, to save their own collective people from extinction. To have a nation is a reasonable demand, and if you try to deprive people from it, then they're going to be willing to get pretty unreasonable to ensure that they get it back.